All right, let me show you how easy Livewire is to install inside your Laravel app. So this is a brand new vanilla Laravel app called The Basics. Let's open it up in our code editor and go to the routes file. So web.php in your routes folder here is kind of the starting point of every Laravel app. And it has this root route registered here, which is just what we're accessing in the browser, and it's returning a welcome view. So let's open that welcome.blade.php right here inside resources views. Now this is the HTML that we're seeing rendered in the browser. Let's scrap all this and add our own. We'll call it Livewire Basics. And then inside here we'll say hello internet. Hello internet. All right, refresh, and there we go. So this just means that we have a place to actually include a Livewire component on the page. So before we do that, we need to install Livewire, and this is literally all you need to do to install Livewire inside your app. Composer require Livewire, and that's it. That's the only piece of configuration or anything. You just install it and everything is done for you. So we have Livewire installed. Now we want to include a Livewire component on the page called, let's say, Hello World. Okay? So we're going to create a Hello World component, and to create a Livewire component, you use the artisan command. So PHP artisan make Livewire Hello World. Okay, now it just created two files for us. The first one is an app Livewire, and that's hello world.php. Let's open this in a new little tab here. Okay, and let's just take a look at this. This is a very simple plain PHP class that extends this Livewire component class and has a single render method. So this is basically the simplest Livewire component you could create, and it just returns a blade view. So let's open up this blade view, hello world, hello world.blade.php. And here it is in the side, and just so you know where that's located, resources views Livewire hello world.blade.php. And then here, let's say hello internet. Okay, so it still says hello internet, and we're all good. So far we didn't really do anything crazy. We created a Livewire component and we extracted that little bit inside of the Livewire component and put it inside the blade, and now we're rendering it on the page, which isn't live at all. So let's add a little bit of interactivity just to show that Livewire is actually working. So instead of hello internet, we're going to say the current time is, and then we're just going to echo out a PHP timestamp, which is the number of seconds past whatever epoch thing, I don't know. And let's make a button here, and this button we'll call refresh. And we're just going to load this on the page. The current time is, and this is the timestamp. And then we hit refresh and nothing happens because it's just a plain button. This is where Livewire comes in. If we add wire click equals $refresh, then Livewire is going to pick up a click if this button is clicked and just refresh the component, which you can always do with this $refresh magic action here. So let's refresh the page. We have that new timestamp. Now if I hit this refresh button, there we go. The page automatically updated. There's no page reload. And now we have a live page with Livewire, and we didn't do much besides just install it and create two files and pop it into the page. So that is the 101 absolute basics of how to install Livewire in your project. Next video, we're going to dive into some more details and actually start building something. So see you there. All right, let's talk about actions in Livewire. Actions are how you tell Livewire to do something. They're kind of like the equivalent of a controller in a normal Laravel app. So we had this hello world component here. Let's remove this and create a new one, and we're going to make a little counter just to demo action. So let's create a new component, PHP artisan make Livewire counter. Okay, now that created our two files for us, counter.php the class, and then counter.blade.php. So let's open up this counter and also the blade view here. Okay, and we'll say count is 1. So we're just going to hard code in a 1 for now. Refresh the page and see that it's on the page. Count is 1. All right, now this value 1 here, we don't want it to be static. We want it to be dynamic so that we can hit a button and increment that number. Let's go ahead and add that button actually. So we're just going to add a plus button, and we're going to make this actually work. It does nothing right now. Okay, so count is 1. Instead of this being static, we need it to be dynamic. So let's create a public property on our class called count, and that's going to be count equals 1. And now here we can just reference that property as a standard variable. So that's something to know in Livewire, where in a normal controller you would have to pass in the data into the view, something like this. But in Livewire, all public properties on the class itself, they get passed to the blade view automatically, and they're just available for you. Okay, so let's refresh the page, and it still works. Count is 1. All right, now comes the action part. Again, actions are how you do stuff in Livewire. So let's reference one first, just like we did in the last video. Wire click increment. Okay, and now we can add a method called increment, public function increment, this count plus plus. So this just means, okay, when click happens, Livewire is going to see wire click, and on the front end, it's going to say when a click happens, call the increment method on the counter class. Then it calls increment, it changes the count, it ups it by 1, and then re-render the whole component and change it on the page. So let's see if this works. We hit plus, and there we go. Now we have a functioning counter in Livewire. And that's really actions at their most basic level. You can think of them like controller methods in standard Laravel controllers. Let's just explore them a little bit more. One thing is we're listening for a click to call this, but you can actually listen for any event in the browser right here. So we could instead listen for mouse enter. And now when my mouse hovers over the 1, it goes to 2. Hover, 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 hover. Yes, so there's mouse enter. There's all sorts of different browser events. You can look at the docs to see what's available, but some common ones obviously is click, submit, listening for a form submission. What else? Yeah, mouse enter, mouse leave, things like that. But yeah, you can even listen for custom events. If you had a third-party library emitting some event, inside of this button, you could listen for that. There's also modifiers, so we can listen for click on the window level. And again, all these things are in the documentation. But if we go ahead and click here, it works, but we can also click anywhere on the whole page because we're listening for click at the window level now. There's helpful things like throttle. We could throttle, let's say, for 1 second. So 1,000 milliseconds, let's throttle this click. So I'm going to click a bunch of times rapidly. Click, 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 click. And it's only ever going to let 1 through per second. That's what throttling is. So there's all sorts of cool stuff that you can do with action modifiers and different events. And you can check that out in the docs. But another thing you want to be aware of is parameters. So you can pass parameters into these methods from the blade view. So let's pass the number 2 and we'll accept it as a parameter here. We'll call by, and then we'll say count equals this count plus by. So this is our way of just incrementing by a specific number. So we pass 2 from the front end, it comes through here, and now every time we hit that increment button, it should increment by 2. And there you go. So one thing to know about parameters, a pretty important thing to know, is just like you can think of these parameters into these actions very much like request data in a normal controller. Like when you submit a form in a normal controller and then you get some data out of the request, like in that case you would say buy out of the request, you know not to trust this data because a user could be submitting the form with any data they want. Well, these parameters are the same way. Just because you hard-coded in the number 2 right here doesn't mean that it's always going to be number 2. So just something to be aware of that I'm going to reiterate as I keep recording these screencasts is that don't trust front-end input through parameters and property input, things like that. Don't trust the front end. So let me show you an example here. I can actually just go into the HTML, find that button. Let's find that specific button. It says increment by 2. And I can just change this to increment by 5. And now I hit plus, and it just incremented by 5. So that's a really important thing to know. Make sure you validate any parameters inputs that's going in right there. And that's pretty much the basics of actions in Livewire. They're incredibly important, incredibly powerful, but as you see, they're stupid simple. It's just a method on a class that you can call from the front end. And one more little security tidbit, any public function is callable. We could have another one called decrement and do whatever, actually decrement it. And even though we're not referencing it inside of our blade view, it is callable in the front end. Like you saw, I could create some HTML in the browser and call decrement. So any public function inside your class is callable by the front end, and any parameter can be passed to it. So you need to validate everything. And if you have some method you need to be private, just make it protected or private, and then it'll be private and nobody can access it. Okay, so that's actions in Livewire. Stay tuned for the next one. Let's talk about properties. See you there. Let's talk about properties in Livewire. They are incredibly essential to your workflow. So I have a basic example, this little to-do list here with a property called to-dos, and it's just an array of a few to-dos, and then that gets passed into the blade view, and we just loop through each one in a list item. So if we render that in the browser, we see those 2 to-dos just listed out right there. But let's make this interactive. We'll just kind of build out this component, and we'll talk about properties along the way. So first thing, we're going to make an input field, a little text input, and that's just going to be right up here. This is where we'll type a new to-do, and then we want to press a button to add that to-do. So let's make a button. We'll say type equals button, and then we'll call this add. Okay. And this is going to be our basic little template here. So what we want to do is type something like wash hamster and then hit add and have it actually append this to the list. So let's wire that up. First thing we're going to do is let's just add this little add action. So we already learned how to do this, but wire click add, and then we'll make a method here called add. And for now, let's just dd hey there. Refresh, and now when I hit add, we've dumped the string hey there. Okay. Perfect. Well, we want to do a little bit better than that. We want to actually take the input from this input field and append it to this to-dos list right here. So how do we do that? Well, this is where properties come into Livewire. So we can use this magical little bit called wire model. Wire model, and then we'll say to-do. And now what this says is basically, hey Livewire, whatever the value of this input is, we want you to synchronize it up with a property called to-do. So let's add that public to-do, and we'll just set this to an empty string for now. Just to demonstrate, we could say wash hamster, save it, refresh, and it's automatically filled with wash hamster. That is actually a magical thing in Livewire. This is one of my highest priorities when I was building Livewire, is I want an easy way to basically keep the value of a property in sync with an input inside a form or something. So it's really simple, really straightforward. Now, anytime you change this on the front end, it changes on the back end. Anytime you change it on the back end, it changes on the front end. It's called two-way data binding. Okay, so we have this wired up here. So when we type into this input, we can have the value inside this backend property. Now let's use it inside add to add it to the to-dos list. So this arrow to-dos. So in PHP, to add something to an array, you just type this double bracket syntax, and then we'll say this arrow to-do. So let's just do that, and I will say wash hamster, hit add, and there we go. It added it to that array, it re-rendered, it showed on the page, great. But it's still in this input field. We want to clear this input field out. So we can do that by just resetting the value of to-do back to an empty string. So we can say this arrow to-do equals empty string. And now when we type into something and hit add, it adds it, and it empties out that input, which is great. And one little tidbit, if you want, you can use Livewire's reset method, where you can just pass in the name of a property and it will reset it back to its original value. This is just a little nice thing. If you don't want to repeat this value twice on the page, you can just hit reset and it should work as expected. Okay, and it does. Great. So that's our kind of really basic version here, but let's talk a little bit more about properties. One thing that I like to do is we have this wire model on an input, and then we use wire click on the button. But if we type into this field, a user often expects to be able to hit enter and have it added. And I'm hitting enter and it's doing nothing because I'm only listening for wire click on this button. So instead of this, it's just a common pattern. Even if it's a single input field, I'll often wrap them inside a form tag. And then instead of listening for wire click on that button, we'll listen for wire submit on the form, and then we'll call add. So we can turn this into type submit, remove that wire click. Okay, so now just to be clear what we're doing, instead of just listening for a click on this button, we're listening for an entire form submission, and then we have a submit button inside of it. And just the way forms work in the browser is anytime you hit enter inside an input field inside a form, it'll submit that form. So let's try this. We'll say wash hamster. I'm getting sick of typing wash hamster. And then I just hit enter, and there it just did it. So perfect. Okay, a little bit more about wire model. Wire model is so powerful, it deserves, a whole course on its own, but I'm just going to brush over a few important little modifiers. So something you'll notice is as we're typing in, well, it's not actually sending any network requests to the server. And let me demonstrate this. So if we have a little span here that says current to do, and then let's just echo out the value of this to do property, okay? So in theory, as I described it, wire model keeps the value of this input in sync with the backend. So as we type, it should just kind of, fill it out on the page, but you'll notice that it doesn't. So here's current to do. As I type, whoops, it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't re-render the page at all. It's not sending any requests back to the server. And that is by design. that is to save on network requests. If I open up the dev tools here and we look at the network requests going back and forth, nothing is going back and forth to your server until you hit that add button. And that's just the way that Livewire is intended to work. But there are times, maybe in a real-time search field or anything where you might want to update the server a little more often, you can add a few different modifiers. So the first one is .live. When you add .live to an input field, as we type, it's going to send network requests to the server, keep that value in sync, and update the page with the value. Again, we wanted to make this opt-in because most of the time you don't actually want this behavior. It's a waste of network resources, but some cases you do want it. And you have full control over how often it does that. Because by default, I think it debounces the input by 250 milliseconds. So that means it's only going to send a request after your fingers have left the keyboard for 250 milliseconds. But you can customize this. We could make it 5 milliseconds. And now as we type, it's just going to be 5 milliseconds and it updates a lot faster. You can use throttle if you want instead of a debounce. So that's .live. And the other most common one, or two most common ones, are .change. So what this is going to do is only update the server when a change event is fired. And in a browser, that happens with an input field when you tab away from that input field. And that's the same with any select dropdown. If this was a select dropdown, every time that was changed, it would then send the network request. So this is good for real-time validation, which we'll cover later, but there's change and then there's also .blur. And .blur is gonna fire, see this is focused, this input field, it's got that blue border. I type into it. When I tab away from it or click away from it, then it's blurred. There's a blur event that happens and then it'll update the server. So you don't have to understand all those exactly. I just wanted to show you some basic ones. I would say stick with wire model by default. If you need a little more often, try .change or .blur. And then if you need it all the time, then do .live. But that's properties in a nutshell, the most basic way to take a public property that's in the back end and synchronize it with an input field in the front end. They're extremely powerful, but it's good to know a little bit about how to customize them and what's going on behind the scenes. Again, we're going to go way deeper on this in other screencasts, but this is properties in a nutshell. See you in the next video. Let's talk about lifecycle hooks in Livewire. We're just going to touch on them. We're going to do the two most popular ones, the two most common ones you're going to encounter. There's plenty to master and learn over time, but we're just going to talk about two. So the first one is mount. So a lifecycle hook is just a method in your Livewire component that allows you to hook into a specific place in your component's lifecycle. For example, mount is going to run anytime the component is mounted on the page. So just to show you, if we dd hey, and if we refresh this page, it's just going to dump hey right away. It's going to interrupt the whole page because this runs as soon as the component gets planted or mounted onto the page. And mount is really useful for setting up your component in any way you need to. For example, right now, these to-dos, they're just hard-coded in here, but you might do something like this. You might keep it empty to start, and then do this to-dos equals, and then paste that in. In general, you're not going to do that for a little static array like this, but you might be getting this out of the database. You might be doing something like to-do all or something where you can't type, PHP won't let you type to do all up here. So this is a pretty common pattern, is setting some default state up here, and then in mount, really initializing any properties that you need to for the component. So let's refresh the page. And now we're kind of back to where we started. We could set this to do equal to some default thing like type to do. We wouldn't really do this. You'd use a placeholder for this, but in theory, you could. Okay, so that's mount. There's a lot more even just to mount, but we'll get to all that later. That's the basic usage of mount. Another common lifecycle hook is updated. So there's updating and updated. And updated is the one you're going to reach for most of the time. This runs anytime a property is updated from something like wire model. Okay, so when we type in a specific to-do and hit add, if we type, wash the hamster, when we hit add, a network request is sent to the server, and there's this update that happens to this to-do property. This gets set to wash hamster. And in updated, we can hook into that, and we get two properties or two parameters. We get property and value. And let's just dump these two. We'll say dump property and dump value. Okay, and now if we say, okay, we just erased all our to-dos, but who cares? All right, so if we type wash hamster and hit add, then we get the name of the property to do. That's the first parameter, property. And then the value that it's trying to update to, or that it just updated to, wash hamster. So we can do anything we want in here. This is a good opportunity to, let's say this arrow property equals string to upper. So this is PHP's little function to uppercase anything you pass in. So we set it to wash hamster, but now we're going to uppercase it anytime we go to update it. So this basically means this property is never going to be set to anything that's not fully uppercased. So let's try this. We'll say wash hamster, hit enter, and now wash hamster in all caps, just like that. There's a little, if you're just targeting a specific property like to do, it's kind of weird. Like this is going to apply to all the properties. You could have an if statement like if property equals to do or something, but Livewire makes this a little easier. You can type updated to do and then skip that property portion. And now you can actually hard code in to do right here, and it should work just how you expect it to work. So that's a pretty common technique there. Another really common thing to do in an updated hook is do some validation. We're going to talk all about validation later on, but you can validate individual properties as they're updated if you were to do something like .change, so that every time somebody is filling out a field and hits tab, they get a little bit of validation, before they submit the whole form. So that's another common pattern inside updated. And that's really it. For all you need to know about lifecycle hooks right now is mount and updated, and you're going to see those soon, and that's going to kind of get you up and running. So that's it for now. We'll talk a lot more about them later. See you in the next video. So far, we've been making these one-off components to show you different things. Let's talk about page components, how you can use components to basically own an entire page in your app. This is how you use Livewire in a more robust way in your application. So if we visit this root endpoint, just nothing in the path here, we get that to-do app. Let's take a look at where that comes from, and then we'll turn it into a page component. So if we open up web.php, this is our routes file in our Laravel app. Everything starts with the routes file. Anytime you need to kind of regain your head around like what's going on inside your Livewire app, start with the routes file. So this is web.php. And this is the root endpoint. And we're loading this welcome view, this welcome.blade.php. So let's open that. All right, so that's what hits right here. This has, kind of the layout of our page that the browser renders. And then we're including this to-dos component within this page. So let's open to-dos. And then this is how it actually renders the to-dos, and it returns a view. So that's quite a few steps. And this is fine for one-off components. This is a pattern that you'll use a lot. But let's say that you wanted to add a new one, like let's say counter, because we already made a counter component in one of the previous lessons. So you could do return view. And now what? Do you create a new page called counter? And then, sorry, not slash there. Do you create a new page called counter? And then do you put, do you duplicate this whole thing and then write counter in there? And then it starts to get repetitive. So let me show you a way that we can refactor this to something a little bit nicer. We can basically remove this middleman here. So instead of route get and then returning a blade view, let's just return the to-do component itself. So to-dos class. And I imported that namespace at the top, app livewire to-dos. And let's take a look at what happens there. Okay, so to-dos, refresh, and we're going to get an error. Livewire page component layout view not found, components layouts.app. So what's happening is all Livewire has right now is you're saying this is the route we want to attach to-dos to. And then we have our to-dos component. But Laravel doesn't know what layout to render this in, what CSS you might need, all of those types of things. Because before we were manually including this welcome view here, right? Okay, so you can manually create this blade view, this components layouts app blade view, or you can just use the nice little artisan command. So PHP artisan livewire layout, and now it just created a new layout file for us in resources, views, components, layouts, app.blade.php, and this is the contents of it. So let's actually load this up here. This is our welcome view, and then it just created this new app.blade.php, which is just a pretty basic layout. It has some meta tags, a title, and then a slot. And this to-dos component is going to get rendered inside this slot. If you're unfamiliar with layouts in Laravel, go to the Laravel docs and learn about layouts, or the Livewire docs. There should be a good amount for you there. So we refresh, and now everything works. So that's great. But we want this to look a little bit more like an app, like with a sidebar, with navigation, where we can navigate to a few different components. So let's beef up that layout here, this layout file, to do more. So we're going to duplicate this route. We're going to call this counter. And then here we'll render counter, our Livewire component here. Refresh. Now nothing is different, but if we visit counter, we now have a route that's attached to counter. Okay, so that's pretty good. That's we're getting there. One thing to note is before inside our welcome view, so if we go to welcome blade.php, we had Livewire Basics was the title, and that showed up here at the top. But now we just have this generic page title, and we can't really customize it to say to-dos. If we do that, it works, but when we go to the counter, it's going to still say to-dos. We want it to be contextual. So this is one of the first thing when you're using page components. One of the first things you want to do is give it a custom title for each different component. So let me show you how to do that. We'll go inside to-dos, and now right at the top here, we're going to add an attribute. If you're unfamiliar with PHP attributes, get familiar. No, like there's documentation around it in the Livewire docs. It's a PHP thing, and you're going to see it a lot in Livewire. And this is the first one we're encountering. This is an attribute called title. So let's import that. It's use Livewire attributes title. And then we can specify a title here, and we'll say to-dos. Now we refresh the page and it says to-dos. We can do the same for counter. So if we go into our counter component and then we add this title, let's import the namespace. We want that to be our Laravel title, Livewire title attribute. And then in here we'll say counter. And now we refresh, and if we go to counter, now the page title says counter. So we have to-dos and counter. So this is just a nice little API, and all that's doing is taking this string counter and passing it through to the layout as $title. So this is just a title property that gets passed through. You can do whatever you want with it, and if you don't add a title to a certain page, it's going to say page title. And in reality, you should make this say like the name of your app, whatever that name is, you can put there as a default page title. All right, so that's page titles, and that's pretty important. But let's beef this up a little bit more and add a navigation bar to the left here that every page component is going to reuse. So they're all going to have the same navigation on the left. So let's do that. Let's just create a little nav right here, and then inside an A tag, so A, and then href, we'll make this the root endpoint, and we'll call this to-dos. And then let's make a counter endpoint, and we'll call this counter. Okay, so this is just a really basic counter and to-dos. It looks pretty horrible, so I made a little bit of CSS that we can add up here that'll make it a little bit nicer. So let's check that out. Link, href, and I just called it app.css. Okay, nice. So now we have like a really basic layout. One last final thing we want to do for this app is when you're visiting a page, you want the current page that's being visited to be highlighted in some way. So I did add some CSS for a class called current that will just make whatever A tag has this current class, it'll make that bold in the left sidebar. But we want to conditionally load that. We only want that current class if it's the current page. So let's just use some standard Laravel to accomplish this. So in Laravel, there's a blade directive called class, where you can basically specify a class and then a Boolean. If it's true, it'll show up as a class. Like, let's just check that out, right? Okay, and if it's false, then it won't show up. So let's do something a little bit smarter. We're going to say request is root endpoint, and now it's going to show up. If we go to counter, it disappears. Let's take this exact string right here and put it into the next A tag, and it's going to be current, but this one is going to be counter. Okay, so there we go. This is a really basic layout for our page components, and we have a nav bar that's shared between them all, and we can switch between components. We can add new components as we want, and now this is kind of a way that you can create a very Livewire owned application. It's really nice. You don't have to have different views for individual Livewire components. It kind of short circuits that process, and this is how I personally set up most of my applications. Most pages are Livewire components themselves, and they have routes in the routes file, titles, navigation, all that stuff. So this is an intro to that. Of course, this topic goes deeper like all these do, but I just wanted to get this set up for the rest of the course so that you have this knowledge going forward. All right, see you in the next video. Before we get deeper into the weeds of Livewire features, I want to kind of pull us out of that and create a small feature, something that you're going to do in most applications you work on, and that is creating tables of data from the database. In this case, we're going to create a list of posts from our database, and I created a new component called show posts with just some stock markup here, this table, and we're going to show a title and a content. And let me show you that in the browser. Super simple stuff. Post title, post content. We're going to fill it with a bunch of data and do a few dynamic things. So let's do it. Let's jump into it. So we need a list of posts that we can loop through in Blade. And if we were doing this in a normal Laravel controller, we would do something like this. We'd return a view, and then we would return some data posts, post all, something like that. Import post. Okay. And this is great. This is actually an awesome way to do it. But something I want to note is a lot of people think when they're using Livewire to store posts in a public property like this. Posts, and then inside mount, do something like this, post equal post all. Okay, this is a pattern you'll find. I consider this an anti-pattern, and I'll tell you why. It works technically. It will work. You can set this as a property and reference it inside your Blade view. However, you're basically statically committing to whatever posts are there when the Livewire component is loaded. You're storing them as a public property, the list of that exact post. So if somebody else in your application deletes a post, it's not going to be reflected in your Livewire component. And also, if you yourself delete a post, if we add a delete button to this component and we delete a post, we then have to remove it from this list. So it's unideal. I would say anytime you're setting an Eloquent collection to a property, just think twice. And what you probably want to do is either pass it directly into the view or use something like computed properties, which you can look up in the docs, and maybe we'll refactor this to that later. But for now, this is great. We return a view and we just pass it some data. And that way, every time Livewire is rendering this Blade view, it's getting posts fresh out of the database. Okay, so let's take those posts and use them in the Blade template. So we'll say for each posts as post, indent this one, and then end for each. Okay, super basic stuff. And if we refresh the page, we'll see that we now have 5 entries in here. It's all dummy content still. We haven't actually filled it with title and content. So let's do that. Let's say post title. And then here we're going to say post content. Okay, refresh. And there we go. We got everything filled out with all of our dummy stuff out of the database. Looking good. So here's a really important note that I want you to just stick in your head. Anytime you're using a for each inside of Blade in Livewire, you need to add keys to each of these items inside that loop. So we'll do wire key post ID. They need to be unique to the individual row. And the reason is if these rows are ever reordered, Livewire needs to know how to keep track of them. So if you're sorting them or if you're deleting something, it needs to know how to keep track. So if we look in the HTML, inside these rows, we now have wire colon key 1 and 2 and 3. It's always going to be the ID. If you're using pagination or anything, you need to make sure that you have wire key on each individual item inside that loop. Super important note to make. It's in the documentation and it can be easy to forget, but just remember, anytime you're looping, add wire key. Okay, so we have title, we have content. It's a little long right now. It's a little verbose. Like it'd be nice to truncate this. So we're going to use a little utility inside Laravel to do this for us. So if we wrap this content inside a string helper, we can say limit, and let's limit it to 45 characters. And that works. But sometimes that'll cut in the middle of words and it looks kind of janky. So you can actually use words instead and do something like, let's limit it to 8 words. And this way we're always kind of ending on an actual word break, not just in the middle of a word. So you decide what you want to do for truncation, but that's good enough for us for now. Everything we've done so far is something you would do inside a normal Laravel app. We haven't done anything dynamic. So let's add a delete button to each one of these rows so that we can click delete and remove a post from the database and from the browser window in real time. So here we go. We'll add a TH here, a little header column, and we're just going to leave this empty because we don't need to really label it. And then down here, we'll add a TD, and inside of it, let's just do what you might think to do first, and then I'll tell you why we shouldn't do it. You might think to add an A tag, like a link with delete, and then something like a hash, and then add your wire click. So you can do this. This is fine. You're not going to get arrested, and it looks fine. But for accessibility purposes and all sorts of other things, you don't want to turn a link, an actual A tag, a link, into something that it's not. These should be buttons. Anything that is interactive on the page should be a button. One tiny reason is if we click on it, it adds a hash to the URL. But again, accessibility tools and things, they'll be confused. They'll think these go to a different page in your application. So as a rule of thumb, avoid A tags for things that aren't actually distinct hrefs in your application. So let's create a button, and we'll say delete. You can always style them like links, but make them a button in your HTML. So here we have these delete buttons, and let's wire them up. Let's say wire click. So we're going to listen for a click, and anytime you're listening for a click, just add type button, because buttons are weird in browsers and they're actually type submit by default. It's just kind of this annoying browser thing that you have to deal with, where if you ever wrap this button in a form, it's going to turn into a submit button, and we don't want that to happen. We want this to actually just be a button that's just a button. Okay, so we're listening for wire click, and let's call a method called delete. And then we'll add this delete method inside of our Livewire component, delete right here. All right, this is where we want to delete the individual post that we clicked, but how do we know which post that is? Well, like you saw in the actions video, we can pass in parameters to these actions. So we could pass in post ID like so. This is another thing I want to make a note of. I see newcomers do this. You might think that you can just put something like this inside of these parameters right here, and you can't, because this, I'll just show you what this looks like in the browser. If we load this and let's take a look at this delete button, and here we have it. It's just hard coded. It's not anything that anything understands. So this takes a little bit of mental gymnastics, but wire click is not magical. This is just echoing straight strings to the browser. So we actually need to echo this into that parameter list. And now if we refresh, we see delete 1, and the second delete button down here is going to have delete 2. So when we click delete, those IDs are going to get passed as a parameter into the action. So we can say post ID, and then here we could just do post find post ID, and then call delete. And we'll talk about how this can be harmful in a second, but this is actually going to make it work. Let's just see it work on the page. All right, we can delete Moonlit Musings. We click delete, and it just worked. So we have a live page. It totally worked. I'm happy with that, but there are a few notes to make. One thing is, anything that's inside of this parameter, like I demoed in another one of these videos, if we go inside the browser, we could actually hijack this and turn it into 10. And now when this delete button is clicked, it's going to try to find the 10th post and delete it. And sometimes in this instance, it doesn't really matter, but let's just say these posts are scoped to a user. You don't want somebody to be able to pass in the ID of a different user's post. So just make sure anytime you're pulling in parameters in an action, make sure it's just like a Laravel controller. Make sure you authorize that the user owns the post before you delete it. But we don't need to do that here. We're just finding a post and deleting it. I do want to show you one other cool thing. If you find yourself doing this where you're passing in an ID and then finding it in the database, you can actually take advantage of model binding from these actions. So we could just type hint post and then accept it as a whole model. And Livewire will go ahead and actually find that post instance for us. So this cleans it up a little bit, and that's just going to work. So it's just a little nice kind of lifestyle improvement that I generally like doing. And that's pretty good. We're almost there. We have a dynamic page. We can delete these, but deleting an item from a database is a pretty dangerous thing to do. And you would hate for a user to just slip up and delete the wrong one and there's no going back. So often you show some sort of confirmation modal like, hey, are you sure you want to delete that thing? And that can be a whole difficult concept in itself. But when I was recording this video, I literally just added a feature to Livewire like an hour ago, specifically for this video, because I think it makes this a lot easier. We can add a confirmation extremely simply by saying wire.confirm and then passing in a message. Are you sure you want to delete this post? And now if we refresh and we click one of these deletes, we get a confirmation. Are you sure you want to delete this post? And now the user has an opportunity to cancel that action and back out of that. Or they can actually delete a stroll in the park, and now it's gone from the table. So that's a really simple data table. We haven't done pagination or table sorting or anything of that sort, real-time searching, anything like that. We'll handle that stuff in future videos and really get into the weeds on that. But I just wanted to show you how I go about adding something like a simple table of data with a delete button. I'll see you in the next video. Forms are one of the most common features to add to any application. Some apps, most apps are honestly just a bunch of forms and a few tables sprinkled in and out. So I think it's really important to at least see what a basic form submission looks like inside of Livewire. So I scaffolded up this really basic create post component that just has some HTML. There's no Livewire or anything. We just have a title field and a content field and a save button. And this is what it looks like: title, content, save, And that's that. We still have our post table from before, and then this is our create post form. So let's turn this into an actual form that does stuff. So first things first, these inputs, well, you know what? Let's work backwards. Let's create a method called save, okay? And then we'll attach this to the form with wire submit save. And inside here, let's just DD, make sure this works, saved. Okay, and now if we hit save, we see saved. If we enter something in and hit enter, it says saved, and we're good to go. Okay, now what do we want to do inside here? This is what you would do inside a Laravel controller. You would create the post based on some content. So we want to fill in a title, and we'll fill that in a second. And then we also want some content here. And that's kind of the most basic thing we could do here. So let's carry on. What would we do here? Inside a Laravel controller, you would get that data out of the request, but this is Livewire. So instead of getting that data out of the request, we're going to make properties for each of those pieces of data. So we'll say title is equal to empty string. We'll make another property called content, and then we'll wire these up to these individual inputs. We'll say wire model title, and then this text area, we're going to say wire model content. All right, and then down here, we can just reference those, this title and this content. Okay. All right, so we should actually have a working form. Let's try it out. Try it out. And some content, and then we hit save. Okay, so nothing happened, but if we look at posts, it actually did work. Try it out, and we were able to add that new post, but it didn't redirect us there. So let's do a redirect. Let's see what that looks like in Livewire. It's very simple. We have a redirect method inside of Livewire. You can actually use the normal syntax, the normal redirect helper that you'd use inside a controller, but this one gives us a few extra options that you'll see later on that are helpful. We'll say this arrow redirect, and then we want to redirect to the post endpoint. So let's try this again. A new post, blah, 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 hit save. And there we go. It added it, and it just redirected us to the page, and it shows us at the bottom of the page. So that's perfect. That is a really basic form, all wired up and done. That's literally how easy it is. But let's add some validation, because you're never really going to make a form without validation. So let's build it out. For title and content, let's make these fields required. So there's a few different ways to do this. And let's see. Let's show you the most basic. This is the most basic way, something very much like what you would do inside a Laravel controller. So this arrow validate, again, this is a method provided to you by Livewire that's just a little bit different than something like request arrow validate, but it's very similar. So validate, and then we pass in some validation rules. So let's say title is required and content is required. So we just want these two fields to be required. If they're blank, we want this validation to fail, it to throw an error, and nothing to work. So let's just try it out first. We have an empty form. If we hit save, okay, it didn't redirect us, so we know that the validation worked, but we don't see a validation message. So let's add validation messages. We're going to do that with Blade's error helper. So we say error, and then the individual property we're looking for, and then let's make this an M tag where we echo out the error message. And then we'll end error here. Okay, so I know I messed that up. You already saw that. Make that an @ symbol. Okay, and this one, instead of title, is going to be content. All right, now let's try to submit the form. And there we go. We have some validation messages because the title field is required and the content field is required. So this is fine, and you can just stop here and be done, and that's how you do a form with validation. But let me show you a form of validation that I prefer. Rather than listing all the validation out down here, I often like to use Livewire's rule attributes. So we say rule, import that namespace, and then required. And now we can actually get rid of these and just call validate. And when we call validate, Livewire will automatically reference rules attached to specific properties. So let's just refresh the page and make sure this works. Okay, and it totally works. And you might ask, what's the advantage of something like this? Well, one, we're co-locating the validation rules with the properties they're concerned with, which I like. But two, you can also do some extra things that otherwise are a little more annoying to do. So we could say, we want this to be the title. And what this is going to do, this as parameter here, let's check it out. If I hit save, it says that the title field is required. So it's a way to easily provide an alias to a validation message. So let's say this was a date of birth. If it's DOB, the validation message to your users would say the DOB field is required, and that's weird. They expect it to say the date of birth field is required. So you could type as date of birth. So that's one nice little helper. Another one that I really like is message. You can just customize the message entirely instead of saying the title field is required, which sounds very much like machine language. We could say, yo, add a title. Come on now, yo. Okay, we hit save, and then it says, yo, add a title. Like, how nice is that? And if you had other validation rules, you could put them in line, but then you have to change the way you attach the message. You can literally just duplicate this. Let's say minimum 4 characters. And then we could say, yo, too short. And we misspelled short, and that's okay. So this says, yo, add a title. We add a few characters. We hit save. Yo, too short. So this is my favorite way to do validation. I think it looks really nice. We're not repeating ourselves, and it kind of like forces you to make your own messages that feel a little more friendly. So that's validation inside Livewire. That's forms. This is pretty much the most basic form pattern for creating something in the database and redirecting away and adding some validation. So a crucial skill to have. Just wanted to show it to you. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, I cannot wait for this episode because we're going to talk all about Alpine.js, Livewire's companion framework. Livewire comes bundled with Alpine.js. Let me show you Alpine. So I actually wrote Alpine to address all these needs I had in Livewire, and it was really tailor-made for Livewire. It's now become a full-on JavaScript framework of its own, and if you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's really simple to get started, and you have access to all sorts of features. You can add data directly in your markup and change classes based on that data and listen for events and yada yada. The list goes on and on. Modals and drop-downs and tabs and everything you would need in the JavaScript-y part, the front end, the part of Livewire, your Livewire app that doesn't go back to the server. Alpine is your tool to do it. There's tons of documentation. There's lots of different features. There's plugins, tons of plugins that do really cool stuff, like a mask plugin if you needed to do like a date of birth field or something. Lots of animation stuff, transition stuff. Okay, so Livewire v3 has actually been sort of written on top of Alpine. So Alpine already comes bundled. You don't have to install anything. Everything we've done so far, we don't have to touch. We can just use Alpine. So let's do something crazy simple. We're just going to make a simple counter in Alpine to get acquainted with it. So Alpine has this directive called xData where you can just drop in data. Like let's say count is 0. And now you can do stuff with it. If we make a span, we can say x text count, and this span is going to be filled with the value of count. So let's refresh the page, and there it is, 0. We can add a button, and we'll listen for a click, x on click, and when this is clicked, we'll increment count by 1. This is all pure JavaScript expressions inside of here. Let's refresh the page. We hit plus, 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 and now we have a little interactive component that's inside of our Livewire component, but it's not really touching Livewire. It's not going back to the server to update itself. This is all just JavaScript that lives in the browser. So this is great for any little interactions in your form or on your page that you don't want to be full Livewire components or go all the way back to the server or something. Okay, so this is a basic counter. Let's do some other stuff. And so here's probably the most powerful feature in Alpine Livewire marriage land. Check this out. X text. And again, you can just put anything here. If I just put the number 5, it's just going to show the number 5. But let's do this. Let's say current title is equal to $wire.title. What is $wire? Well, let me just show you. If we refresh and then we type into the title field, it fills in automatically. So when you're inside Alpine, you can interact with your Livewire component with this $wire object. Every property in your Livewire component exists on $wire as a plain property. So it's basically your portal from Livewire into pure JavaScript. You can do anything you would need to do in JavaScript. Like you could use .length and that'll give you the length. Or let's do to uppercase. This is just a JavaScript function or method on a string. And now it's going to uppercase that string. We could even append, we could append the $wire.content. And now when we type in, we get that concatenated or whatever into the string. Okay. So that's really cool. Accessing properties is a really, really powerful feature, but let me show you another one. Let's just make a button that says clear title, and we'll say x on click, $wire.title equals empty string. So now whatever's filled in title, when we hit clear title, it clears it for us without sending a network request to the server at all. That's just pure Alpine. So not only can you access properties and mutate properties, you can actually call methods. So we could call save directly from this button right here that says, let's just say submit form. And let's remove this. I just want to make it not work to show you that this doesn't submit the form automatically. Wait, it did because of type submit? I don't know. Let's try this. Okay, yeah, this does nothing. Now we say X on click, $wire.save, and now it will actually submit that form. So any method that exists on your Livewire component, you can call as a method directly on $wire. You could even pass in, a number or pass in any parameters and then accept those parameters inside of the method. So I can't overstate how powerful this combination is. Let's actually do something sort of useful with it to demonstrate what you might actually use it for in an app. So let's say you have this content field here for your post where you want to show users how long their post is as they're typing so that they're aware of, I don't know, how many characters are in there. So let's do that. Let's add this little small element and we'll say characters, colon, and then add a span. And let's put this on a new line just so it's a little bit nicer. Now inside span, we could just use Alpine. We'll say X text $wire.title.length. And that's going to give us the number of characters in content. So now as the user types, hey, this is my post. Okay, nothing is happening because we did something wrong somewhere along the line. $wire, .content. We were using title. Okay. Hey, this is my post. And now it's live updating this character counter. As they're typing, it feels very dynamic, like a JavaScript application. And maybe you want to instead count words, and you can just use JavaScript. You can split that string into an array based on another string. So we could say split the content into an array separated by an empty character or a space. And then we'll get the length of that array, and we're going to offset it by 1 because that's just how array counting works. So word 0, and we can say, hey, and now I hit space, and now that's the first word. There, you, I don't, yeah, right? Okay. So that's cool. That is Alpine. That's just scratching the surface. A lot of these things like wire submit under the hood, they're just using Alpine. You can do the same thing with X on submit.prevent default equals $wire.save. Most things you can do with wire in Livewire, you can actually just use Alpine for. But obviously, this is a little more verbose. It's a little more bare metal, so we like to provide really nice, clean syntaxes that don't require a lot of mental overhead. So I'm definitely exposing you to some more complicated features, or this is maybe just 102. This isn't Livewire 101. Livewire 101, you're just using the basic stuff, but I want to show you the power of Alpine and how you can use it to do basically anything you would need to do inside any application you can do with Livewire and Alpine. There you go. I'll see you in the next video. Let's talk about testing in Livewire. So when you create any sort of app, you're often manually testing things. Like you make a change, then you go, oh, I want to make sure that the form still works. Okay, validation works. And if I type in, right, and that's fine. Manual testing is a totally valid form of testing. However, it can get cumbersome and time consuming and downright impossible later on when your app gets huge and you need to test everything. So that's where automated tests come in. If you're not familiar with automated testing in PHP, that's kind of outside the scope of this tutorial. This is more just showing you how to test in Livewire. But assuming you know a thing or two, you know what, even if you don't know a thing or two about testing, let's just show you how to test a Livewire component. So first thing is creating a test. You can do it manually, or Livewire allows you to do it when you type PHP artisan make Livewire. So if you did make Livewire create post, so we already did that to create this component, but you can append this little test flag here, and it will go ahead and create the test for you. We've already created the create post, but by running this again with test, it's going to create the test for us. So let's find that test inside our application. So here we're in app Livewire create posts. To find our test, we go down to tests, feature, Livewire, and then there's our new create post test. So let's open that to the side, and Livewire scaffolded this for us with a single test. So to run this test, you do that with PHP unit. By the way, if you're familiar with pest, if you would rather use pest, you can just append pest instead of test at the end. It's when you're creating a component, and it'll create a pest test for you. But for now, we're just using PHP unit because that's what ships with Laravel, but pest is totally great too. So to run this test, you type PHP unit. This will run the whole test suite of our application. And there's tests in there that are failing because of whatever. There's just Laravel tests that it ships with that are just failing. So we're going to run this specific test. We're going to say tests, feature, Livewire, create post test. And now we can run that specific test and get that green back. So we see that it passed. So for me, I don't really like typing this every time. So I made a little extension for VS Code. If you're a PHP Storm user, they have this out of the box, but for VS Code, it can't test like PHP unit out of the box. So I created this little extension called Better PHP Unit that you can install inside VS Code. And this allows you to just use a little shortcut key, Command KR, and then just run the test automatically that your cursor is under, and then Command KP, and it'll rerun that test for you. All right, so this is what it scaffolded us with. It just said render successfully, tests the create post component, and assert status is 200. That just means that the status code of the page is 200, meaning it worked. There's no failure. If there was a failure, like let's say we added mount and we, I don't even know, abort 404, and then we rerun our test, it's going to fail, and it's going to say failed asserting that 200 is identical to 404. So this test right here is actually really valuable, even though we're not testing anything specifically. It's what's called a smoke test. It's basically saying, hey, if we load this thing, does the thing blow up? Okay, it doesn't, and that's pretty valuable. But let's do one better and actually write some tests that are a little more specific. So that's render successfully. The next test that I like to write when I'm testing a component is the happy path test. So I want to write a test that basically tests the thing this component's supposed to do, which is save a post to the database. So let's do that. We're going to name our test. We're going to call it can create new post. Okay. And now inside here, first, before we even do the Livewire testing, let's get a post out of the database post where title is some title. Now we haven't added that to the database, so it should fail. Where title, we'll get the first one, and then we'll say this assert null. We want to make sure that this doesn't exist in the database, and let's import post. And again, we haven't done anything Livewire related yet. This is just a pretty standard PHP unit test. So let's run this. Okay, that doesn't exist in the database. We're good. Now we get Livewire, we say test, and let's grab our create post component. And now we can basically chain on actions and assertions, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So we're testing the create post component right here. Let's fill it with a title and content, and then hit save, all with an automated test. So we'll say set title. And this is something provided you by Livewire, this set function here. Set title to some title, and then we'll also say set content to some content. Okay, and then let's call save. All right, we can rerun our test, and it's going to pass, but it didn't really tell us much. It just didn't break. So what we want to do is now get that same post out of the database again and make sure that it's not null. So let's refresh and we run it, and there we go. It passed, so we say it's null. Okay, that worked. And now we say not null. And now we're pretty much there, but we can take it one step further and actually assert that it has the right title and content. So we'll say assert equals title, or sorry, we'll say some title, and then get the post title. And then for content, we'll do the same. We'll say some content, get the post content. And if this passes, we know that the whole thing works, that it wasn't in the database. Then we added it to the database with Livewire. We got it back out of the database, and everything looks hunky-dory. Rerun the test, and everything passes. So that's a totally good test. And again, this is the happy path. This is one of the most important tests for a component. Let's create a new one, and let's test the validation. So this, we're going to say, what do we say? We want to test that the title is required, so we'll just say title is required. Okay, and now this test is going to be a lot simpler. We don't really need to test anything in the database. We can just say set title to empty string, call save, and this should work. It's not going to really tell us anything. We didn't even make any assertions, so it's saying we didn't perform any assertions. So Livewire gives us some assertions for validation. So we could say assert has errors. We run that test and it passes. So we know that there are validation errors. We can do a little bit better. We can say assert that there's validation errors for the title property. And there we go, it still passes. And then we can do even further. We can pass in the specific validation error that we're looking to see. Assert that it has required, and then we're good. If we change this to min4, it's going to throw an error and say something like failed asserting that an array containing min, whatever, for the title attribute, okay? So we stick to required, we get passing, and there we go. That's the most basic test setup. We have a smoke test, we have a happy path test, and then we have specific tests for the edge cases. That's generally how I test a component in those 3 stages. And then testing is a whole other topic again. It's kind of out of the scope of this tutorial, and this is not meant to be a how-to test in Laravel. There's plenty of content on that, but this is just to show you that Livewire makes it so easy to test its components. And this is the beautiful thing, because a lot of other setups, like a JavaScript setup, you can't just do something like this. You have to create a browser test that fills in something in the browser and then hits a button and sees something on the page. And those are slow, they're brittle, they're valuable, but these are really easy to write. They're super fast. And this is just a great way to have a test suite at your back so that when you're developing and you're changing something, you can run your test suite and know, like for example, let's say we just remove this part, and we thought that was fine, but then we run our test and it goes, oh, it fails. And we go, oh, what happened? Oh, we removed the validation. So we know that something broke that we needed to not break. So that's testing in Livewire. Super powerful feature. It's up to you whether or not you want to even test your components. I just want to show you how you can do it and how it can be pretty valuable. See you in the next video. Okay, here comes a deep topic, and that is nesting. Nesting components in Livewire is extremely powerful, but there are lots of pitfalls and implications and such. So we're going to start with the most basic nesting component scenario. We have a table of posts right here where we're looping through in our blade view. We're for eaching through posts, and we're just showing blade. So nothing fancy is going on here at all, but this may be a good opportunity for nesting. Like for example, let's just say you wanted to break this up into smaller pieces so that it's not all in one giant component. That's fine. In general, I would warn you against that, and we're going to talk later about that. I would warn you against extracting a Livewire component just for the sake of making your blade shorter in a single file. In those cases, I would say extract a blade component, which you can learn about through Laravel documentation. We're going to talk about in a couple videos, but that's the first thing I would warn you. Let's say that you actually wanted to do something more complicated though. Like you have a delete button here. Let's say you also want an archive button that archives an individual part of the row or an individual row, or maybe an edit button that turns this into an edit field. When things get more complicated for an individual row, you end up adding lots of methods that deal with just a specific post and yada, yada, yada. In those cases, I would say you are warranted to create a sub Livewire component, a nested Livewire component. So let me just show you how we can extract individual components for each one of these rows, pass the post into it, and let's just check it out. So let's create a new component. We're going to say artisan, PHP artisan, make Livewire, and we're going to call this post row. So we have a new component called post row that we're going to reference right here, just like any other Livewire component. We'll say post row, and let's just load the page and see if it works. So it worked. There's 5 invisible rows here because they're just empty divs. Let's open up post row. Okay, so this is post row, which we're just rendering a simple blade view. Let's also open up its blade view and make our editor completely nonsensical. Okay, so this TR right here, this whole table row, let's extract this and replace the contents of post row with what we have right there. And we're just going to load the page, and we're going to get an error because we're referencing post inside this nested component now, and that doesn't exist. It's not a property of this nested component. So if we load the page, we're going to get an undefined variable post. So this is our current mission. Let's close this out for a second. Our current mission is, how do we get this post inside this nested post row component? Well, it's fairly simple. This is just like blade components. If you're familiar with those, you can pass properties like so. You append a colon when you want to pass in PHP. So something like this. If you lose the colon, this just passes in the string $post. So we'll pass in this colon here, colon post equals post. And now inside here, we have a mount method. Now this is the other common use for a mount method that I didn't touch on in the lifecycle events or the lifecycle hooks video, but mount methods actually accept parameters. So we can accept post and set it as a property on this child and say public post, just like that. And now if we refresh the page, everything works and we're back to normal. One thing I want to note that is super important. Let's open up this post row blade view here. We had wire key on the individual rows, and that's fine. But what we want to do is anytime you have that for each, remember you need to have a wire key, and that includes nested components. It actually behaves a little bit differently. I'll paste it in just so we can see that we're adding wire key post ID, and that's fine. Again, this allows Livewire to keep track of what order these should be in when things change on the page. We refresh the page and everything works. There is a shorthand though. If you prefer, you can just do colon key, and then you can just reference the post ID just like that. So this is just for Livewire components. This wouldn't work on the TR itself. This is just for when you're nesting a Livewire component, you specify a key. Extremely important. In fact, more important than the wire key on the TR that we added before. Remember, anytime there's a for each, just hear me yelling at you. Make sure you have a key. Okay, so we have key post ID. We're passing in the post into the nested component. There is a nice little shorthand. If this feels redundant to you, like you're just repeating yourself twice, you can just do this, $post, and that'll pass through just as you would expect it to. So we're good. We have our nested Livewire post row. We're passing in post. We have our key. We're totally good. We can get out of that for now. And now let's take a look at this post row component here, and then we'll open. I know this is a lot in a single editor, but I think it's still more helpful for you to just keep it kind of all in your head, seeing them next to each other rather than me switching between files in a jarring way. So this is good. We've recreated what we want to create, but there is a problem. Can you spot the problem? If we hit delete, it's going to call wire click delete, and it's going to look for that delete method on this component now, because this is the component we're in. It's not going to reach above to the parent, and we're going to get an error. If I try to hit delete, are you sure? Okay. We're going to get this unable to call component method, public method, delete, not found on component. So there's a few options, and there's a few good and bad ways to achieve this. There are events in Livewire. If you've ever seen something like dispatch, you can do dispatch, and you could dispatch an event to a parent component and listen for it. And that's a lot. It's verbose, and there's all sorts of little performance implications. In a scenario like this, if you can, anytime you can, reach for this, parent.delete. So now we're just saying, instead of calling delete on this component here, call it on the parent, and everything should still work as normal. And let's test it out. If we want to delete rediscovering art, let's say delete, okay. All right, everything worked. So we're basically back to where we were before. Everything's all set up with our table and then our nested post rows. And we can leave it at that. This is a fine way to extract components, but let's do something a little bit more complicated just to show you why it's beneficial to even nest in the first place. So I'm going to get rid of this parent here just so that we can focus on the parent or the post row. We have this delete button. Let's also add an archive button. So we'll say archive, and then wire click. Instead of parent.delete, we can just call archive, and we'll say, are you sure you want to archive this post? And now we can add a simple little archive method right here where we say this post arrow archive. And I already have this set up in my Eloquent model. And now once a post is archived, it sets a Boolean on the post to true or false, and that is an is archived little Boolean. So I'll show you that in a second. When a post is archived, well, maybe, okay, we're going to do it. When a post is archived, we want to add a class called archived, and we'll add it conditionally only when post is archived. Okay. So we refresh the page. None of these are archived, but if I hit archive, are you sure you want to archive this post? Okay, there we go. And now it added that class for us. I'll just show you in the browser here. On the table row, we now have class empty string for taste coffee, but if we look at this table row, we have class equals archived because it is archived. We want to remove that archive button if it is archived, so let's add a little conditional above button. We'll say unless post is archived, then show the button, and unless. So this is going to just remove that button. If it's already archived, we refresh the page and now archive is gone. We can easily archive another component, and then it goes ahead and it simply archives it. We can still now delete that component, and everything works exactly how you'd expect. It's totally efficient. It's easy to reason about. And again, the benefit of nesting a component in this scenario is you can have all of these methods and abilities inside the post row itself, acting on a singular post. Otherwise, we would have to call archive and pass in the post ID, and it just gets more and more complicated. So this is a great example of this. And now you might ask, why didn't I create a delete method here? I could have a delete method here that says this post arrow delete. But the problem with this is if we were to do this and delete was called on this component itself, it would delete the post from the database, but it wouldn't refresh the parent, because that's how Livewire components work. Every Livewire component is an island. That means every network request that gets sent to the server only has that singular Livewire component. So if we were to do that, we could, I could show you how it would break. But in general, here's my heuristic. Here's my rule of thumb. If it's an action that affects the list that a parent has, so in this case, the parent has the list of posts, if any of these actions impact that list, meaning they reorder them, they remove one, they add one, keep all that behavior in that parent component. If it's something that just impacts itself, keep it in the nested child. So it's very intuitive. It's an intuitive rule, but sometimes it's easy to forget. So I just encourage you that anytime you're adding functionality that deals with the parent list, keep that functionality on the parent and call $parent. If it just deals with itself, then just deal with itself right in the subcomponent itself. All right, one more little bit to show you. We passed in the post through mount here, and that's fine. That's exactly what we want to do, but there is a shorthand if you would prefer. You don't actually need mount if it's the same name that you're passing through. So let's refresh and show you that this works, and that's great. You can even type hint that if you want, and that looks a little bit nicer, but you don't always need mount unless you want to use mount, unless you have a specific use case for it. And in fact, this is another cleanup we can do. This render function where we're returning the blade view, if it's the default blade view location, livewire.postRow, you can actually delete that too, and Livewire is still just going to work totally fine. So it gets rid of a lot of visual noise, and there we go. We have a nested Livewire component where we're passing a property through. It's very straightforward. It's a static component, and we've learned about, calling parent functionality or calling functionality on itself. Very important lessons here. I hope you absorbed them well. See you in the next video. One of the coolest features in Livewire version 3 is Navigate. It allows you to easily navigate between pages without doing a full page reload. As you notice, this little world icon, every time we're changing pages, it's refreshing. That means the whole page is being fetched brand new from the server, the current one's being torn down, and the browser is rebuilding and painting the new page. And in this scenario, it's not that big of a deal because we're doing it all locally. The times are nothing. We're not really going to a server, but in the real world, you're going out to a server, your users have slow connections, it's a different story. So if we throttle this down to 3G, you notice things take a lot longer and the whole page has to do, all of this tearing down and rebuilding. So let me show you Navigate. So this is like one of the simplest features ever. This video is a joke. It's basically wire navigate. You add wire : navigate to any link on your page. This is our little navigation element in our layout. We add wire navigate and we're done. And that's it. You can do this to any link on any page in any Livewire app. And now when I switch pages, watch the world icon, it's just instant. It's lightning fast. This doesn't change at all. Livewire intercepts the request and it fetches the new page behind the scenes and then swaps the old page with the new page in place. So it's crazy fast. It works with back and forward buttons. It uses a cached version of the previous page when you hit the back button. So it's truly instant. In fact, it's so smart that it knows when you mouse down on a page and it starts requesting the new page. So even if you're on a slow connection, you mouse down and it's already fetching it. And by the time the user lifts up on their mouse, it instantly shows. So it's extremely smart and it's just a no-brainer for most applications because it's going to make your app feel incredibly fast. Again, this could basically be the whole video, just add wire navigate. There's some other features involved. You can have persistent parts of the layout if you had a checkout, like for some sort of e-commerce store, if you had a cart checkout number, you could keep that persistent so that it stays the same throughout the pages, or a podcast player that you don't want to reload between page loads. We're not going to get into that in this tutorial. We're going to get into that stuff later. I just wanted to show you the most basic usage. The only thing I think we can add here is in our create post page, after you finish adding a post and you hit save, it still does a full page reload because that is a redirect. And redirects are handled a little differently. So if we go into that create post component and then down to our save method, here we're redirecting back to the whole show post page. we can just add navigate true. And now it's going to use Livewire's navigate feature to do the redirect. It's opt-in because you might not always want this, and sometimes you're redirecting away from the page. It's just an opt-in feature for a few reasons. So let's try this again. We add a title, some title, we add some content, and then we hit enter, and there we go. It did the redirect without a page reload. It was pretty much instant, and then it adds it down here, and everything is still just as reactive as it was before and as we wanted it to be. So that's Navigate. It's a no-brainer feature. It's a simple video to make because there's not that much to it. But behind the scenes, Livewire is doing a ton of heavy lifting to make your app feel lightning fast. All right, and that pretty much ties it up for this section, this 101 of Livewire. You have the tools you need to make basic Livewire apps or soup up your current Laravel apps to just add a little bit of functionality. There's going to be lots more videos and courses to go deeper into all the little features and techniques that you can do with Livewire to make your apps really sing. But thanks for hanging in there. I hope you learned a bunch. See you in the next course.